One of the biggest concepts, of course, in SharePoint is handling authentication. And up until now, we've seen how we can internally handle authentication, either by utilizing Windows authentication or by utilizing Forms authentication. However, in both of those scenarios, there's a couple of different downsides if we're going to be incorporating with external entities. This is where federated authentication comes into play. If we're doing Windows authentication, the downsides are pretty obvious. That what's going to need to happen is we're going to need to create Windows accounts for people who aren't actually in our network. Generally speaking, security-wise, that's a bad idea. On the flip side, if we're going to do Forms authentication, there's a couple of downsides here as well. The first big thing, as we already discussed, is the fact that we're going to need to create the forms for creating accounts, passwords, our own management tools, etc. So that's really going to slow down the development cycle, not to mention the fact that when a new person goes to access our environment, they're now going to have to create yet another account. Now, with federated authentication, as we're going to see, we're going to be able to utilize an external authentication provider and allow SharePoint to be able to communicate with that. The other thing that we're going to take a real quick look at the end here is the ability to set up server-to-server authentication, which will actually allow us to take those claims and be able to use them against other implementations. But let's start off by taking a look at how we're going to implement federated authentication in SharePoint. Federated authentication is basically the concept of having some form of an external entity handle the authentication for us. Now, you might be wondering why we might decide to implement this. Well, there's a couple of very good reasons for us to do this. First of all, is if we're dealing with third parties. So for example, if we've got different vendors, if we've got different contractors who already have, say for example, an Active Directory implementation, we can take advantage of that. That we can allow them to authenticate to their network and then pass their credentials into our SharePoint implementation and be able to use that to authenticate them. We can also use this for public-facing sites as well. So for example, we could actually utilize, say, Windows Live Authentication, Facebook, Twitter, or otherwise, to be able to utilize a person's existing credentials that they have with another implementation, and again, have those be passed into our environment. Now, what you're going to notice with SharePoint is that we've got a couple of different ways that we can handle federated authentication. One way is by utilizing Active Directory Federated Services, or ADFS, and this is what I was mentioning before, where we're going to have an external Active Directory implementation. Our users will actually authenticate against that implementation, and then the token will be passed to us. Now, you're also going to notice that we have this concept of OAuth, which is a standardized protocol for handling authentication. And you're going to notice that a lot of major providers already implement this. And that would include people like Facebook, Google, LinkedIn, etc. So people can actually utilize their Facebook account and be able to authenticate against Facebook and again have that token be passed into our SharePoint implementation. And this can again make it a little bit easier for our users because now they don't have to create yet another account. They can simply use the account that they already have with Facebook. Now, in order to implement some form of federated authentication, we're going to want to utilize Windows Azure Access Control Service, or ACS. ACS is hosted inside of Windows Azure, and it will handle the authentication automatically for us. Now, what's very nice about ACS is that I can go into ACS, implement this, and choose from one of multiple different providers. In addition, I can actually just go in, configure SharePoint basically once, and then go back to ACS and add and remove different authentication mechanisms. If you want to configure OAuth in SharePoint 2013, this is the way that you're going to do it, is you're going to utilize Windows Azure ACS. Now, you are going to notice that there's a little bit of work that needs to be done to tell SharePoint about ACS and our ACS implementation. And of course, this is going to be done inside of PowerShell, and we'll see that script when we get into the demo. Now, there's a lot of different steps that are going to take place when it comes to utilizing ACS. So let's try and walk through all of those here. Now, what you're going to notice on my little screen here is that I've got the main moving parts. That we've got our browser, we've got SharePoint, and we've got ACS. Now, you're going to notice that we've already created a trust relationship in this little diagram between SharePoint and ACS. So that way, ACS kind of knows that we're coming and knows what to expect from us. You're also going to notice off to the lower right-hand side that we've got our authentication provider. And this could be ADFS, this could be Facebook, this could be Google, this could be a Microsoft account, say Windows Live ID, for example. Now let's take a look at the basic steps here. What's going to happen is that my user is first going to connect to SharePoint. Now when they connect to SharePoint, SharePoint's of course going to ask them to authenticate. And they're then going to choose our Windows Azure ACS authentication provider. When they do that, they're then going to get redirected to the authentication provider. Now, the authentication provider will then prompt them for their username and password. So, for example, if they were doing Facebook, the browser is going to be redirected to Facebook. They're going to punch in their username and password, and then Facebook is going to hand back a token. Now, the thing about that token is that it needs to be normalized. So what's then going to happen is the user is going to get rerouted to Windows Azure. Windows Azure is going to take that token and send that back to the browser in a format that SharePoint will then be able to understand. Our browser is then going to take that token, pass that into SharePoint. SharePoint's going to look at that token and go, yep, that came from Windows Azure. I'm going to accept that and then move on from there. So again, you'll notice the basic steps. We connect to SharePoint. SharePoint's going to bounce us back and say, hey, go talk to the authentication provider. The authentication provider is going to prompt the user for the username and password. It's going to issue a token back to the user. The browser will automatically then be rerouted to Windows Azure, so that way Windows Azure can go ahead and sign off on that token. And then the browser is going to be redirected with that token back to SharePoint. SharePoint's going to look at that. It's going to see that it was signed off on by Windows Azure and then trust it. Now, one of the little things that's worth noting here is that all of this basically takes place inside of the browser. That the browser is going to get the different commands to contact all the different services. So the browser is going to try and connect to SharePoint. It's then going to get rerouted to the authentication provider, get rerouted to Windows Azure, and then again get rerouted back to SharePoint. The upshot of this is that this means that our SharePoint implementation does not need to be accessible from the outside world. In fact, when I get in to do my demo, what you're going to notice is that my SharePoint implementation is not accessible from the outside world, but I'm still going to be able to take advantage of this. So if you're going to be using, for example, ADFS, where maybe we've got contractors that are currently on site, but they're using a SharePoint implementation that's not accessible from the outside world, we can still use ADFS. We can still use our Windows Azure ACS in that scenario. Now that we've seen the moving parts, let's get in and take a look at how to actually implement this. You're going to notice the basic steps here for setting all of this up. The first thing that we're going to need is we're going to need a Windows Azure account. Now, when I get in to do my demo, I've already got this created. The next step is then to enable the application. And you're going to notice that there's basically two steps here that we're going to need to set up the identity provider, and that's going to be our pointing to, say, Facebook, Windows Live ID, Google, etc. And then we also need to set up our relying party, and that's going to be our application to tell Windows Azure, hey, this is now what's going to use that identity provider. Now, in order for communication to take place between our application and Windows Azure, we are going to need to send Windows Azure a certificate. So that way it can use this to encrypt our traffic and to be ensured that we are, in fact, who we say we are. So we'll need to go ahead, create a certificate, and upload that. And then finally, we'll need to enable the authentication mechanism inside of SharePoint. So that's going to be the basic steps, is our Windows Azure account, set up the application inside of Windows Azure, upload our certificate, and then go back to SharePoint and enable this and tell SharePoint where Windows Azure is. Now, a couple little things that I've already got set up for me. Number one is I already have a Windows Azure account that I'm going to go ahead and use. Number two is that I've already created the certificate. Now, you could create the certificate using make cert, but that's not a best practice for production. So I actually have a CA, a certificate authority, set up inside of my environment, and that's what I use to create the certificate. So let's get in and take a look at how to implement this. Let's start off by firing up Internet Explorer and connecting out to Windows Azure. There we go. And I'm going to log in. Now, what I'm doing is I am logging in to my Microsoft account. Happens to also be linked up with Windows Azure, but I'm logging in with my Microsoft account. One of the great advantages to federated authentication is that if a user's already authenticated, like I have here, when they go to browse to another site that's going to use that same form of authentication, they're not going to be prompted for their username and password again. Now, what I'm going to need to do to set this up is I am going to need to create my little service. So I'm just going to come down here, hit New, and I'm going to go to App Services and Access Control. And I'll just hit Quick Create, and I'm going to give this a namespace of Geek Trainer, and let's choose West US and hit Create. And we'll give this just a moment here. Cool. Activating, activating, activating. So now that our ACS is activated, let's go ahead and select that and hit Manage. Now, like I said, what we're going to need to set up is we're going to need to set up our identity provider and our relying party application, as well as our certificates. And basically, you just start from the top. So I'm going to hit my identity providers, and what you're going to notice is Windows Live ID is already there. Now, that's the one that I'm going to use for my demo, but I do want to highlight here that if I hit Add, you're going to notice that I do get other providers available to me as well. So you'll notice that I've got Facebook, I've got Google, and I've got Yahoo. And of course, if I want to do ADFS, then I can do ADFS. Now, since we're already using Windows Live ID, there's nothing else that I'm going to need to configure. So I just need to kick on over to my relying party applications. And so now I'm going to hit Add, and this is going to ask me for the display name, and I'm going to say public.geektrainer.com, and I'm going to set up my realm to be http:// public.geektrainer.com. keytrainer.com. Now, this is something that you very well may find yourself doing with your SharePoint implementation as opposed to doing forms-based authentication. Because like I mentioned before, the problem with forms-based authentication is that you have to do a lot of work for all the user account creation and so forth. By using this, now I'm basically not only letting somebody else take care of it, but chances are your users are already going to have a Windows Live ID or already have Facebook. Now, we do need to tell Windows Azure where to redirect the user back to once the authentication has taken place, and that URL is always going to be, we'll say public geektrainer.com/_trust. So it's going to be whatever our URL is, _trust. Now, if we want an error URL, we can set that there. The token format for SharePoint needs to be SAML 1.1. SAML stands for Security Application Markup Language, and it is a format of XML, basically for formatting the token that's going to be sent. Now, our token timeout should actually be higher than the 600 that's set up by default. So I'm just going to make that 3600. That will actually work just fine. And then you're going to notice it will ask us about our identity provider and ask us about our rule group. Now, the rule group is all about how to take the token and get it ready for passing into SharePoint. Now, I'm just going to let it create the rule group for us and hit save. And now what you're going to notice is that it set up our relying party application. I go into my rule group, and there's my very basic default rule group. Now, unfortunately, it doesn't actually create any rules. The good part is this is very easy. Just click Generate, make sure Windows Live ID is selected, click Generate, and voila, we're done. We've now created the rule that we're going to need here. Now what I need to do is I need to set up my certificate and keys. So I'm just going to click there. I'm going to click Add, and I'm going to browse to my certificate. Now, one of the things that I want to highlight here about the certificate is you'll notice right up top, they have the necessary command line for doing makecert. Again, not a best practice for production, just fine for dev and testing, but not a best practice for production. I'm going to use the certificate that I already have, so I'm just going to hit Browse, and I put my certificates inside my C drive to make things nice and easy, and there is the PFX file that needs to be uploaded. So we'll go ahead and hit Open and punch in the password that I used to encrypt that. And now I'm just going to scroll down, and I'm going to hit Save. So there it is. So we're using our Windows Live ID. We set up our relying party by telling Azure about our SharePoint implementation. We set up our very basic rule, and we set up our certificate. That's all that needs to be done inside of Azure. Now it's time to turn our attention to the SharePoint implementation. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create the application, and then I'm going to go back and set up our trusted provider. So let's create our application by just navigating on over to our central admin site. And I'm going to click Manage Web Applications. And I'm going to hit New. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to call this Public. We'll set port 80, and we'll say public geektrainer.com. And I have a comma there. Let's fix that. There we go. And then I'm going to scroll on down, and what you're going to notice inside the authentication types is that we've got our typical Windows, we've got our form space, but our trusted is currently empty. And we're going to populate that in a couple of minutes here. I'm going to scroll down a little bit further, and I'm going to make sure it's inside of our existing app pool. There we go. And let's set up our database to be SharePoint public content. Perfect. And we'll give that just a second. Okay. So now that we've got our web app, let's go ahead and create our site collection. And we'll just give this a name of public. And I'm going to scroll on down and make myself the SCA. And I'm going to scroll on down, and I'm going to hit OK. OK. So now we've got our top site successfully created. So I'm just going to go ahead and hit OK. So now we've got the application set up. Now we need to configure the trusted provider inside of SharePoint. And this is again going to be done through PowerShell. So I'm going to fire up the ISE here. And I'm going to open up my little trusted claims provider here. Now, what you're going to notice is we need to set up the realm. This realm, by the way, is the realm set in ACS. So if you remember that little screen where it asked us for the realm and we typed in the http://public.geektrainer.com, that needs to be set inside of ACS. You'll also notice on the sign-in URL, if I scroll over to the right, that we've got the exact same thing at the very end, that we've got our realm HTML encoded, which is why you've got the %3a, %2f, %2f, public.geektrainer.com, %2f. So there is our realm there. And we've got our certificate location, and that's inside my C drive. And we're going to go ahead and set up the root authority, which is just going to tell SharePoint, hey, here is the certificate that we're going to use. We've got our claim mappings, and that's basically just going to handle the identifier and the email address for us. So that's basically just boilerplate code. And then down at the very bottom, we're going to set up our new identity token issuer, give it a name of Azure and a description of Azure. We'll set up our realm, we'll set up our claims mapping, our sign-in URL, our identifier claim, and again, that's just boilerplate, and then the certificate that we've got. This is really actually pretty much just boilerplate code, just needs to be executed. So I'm going to execute it. And what you're going to notice is we didn't get any error messages, so that tells us that it worked. And now I'm going to go back to our app management. I'm going to go to public and our authentication providers. And if I hit my default and I scroll on down, now you're going to notice that we have Azure. And that was brought to life by us going in and running that script. So now let's go ahead and scroll the rest of the way down and hit save. Okay. So now that we've got the authentication provider set up, the last thing that I want to do for my little demo is allow access to everyone. Now, I'm going to do this by using the user policy, which is actually something we're going to see in a different lesson. That the user policy gives us the ability at the web application level to globally apply permissions. So I'm just going to choose Add Users here, hit my little drop down, and choose the default zone. Hit next, and I'm going to browse. And what you'll notice is that under all users, I've got all users Azure. So I'm just going to hit add, I'm going to hit OK, and I'm going to give full read permissions. And let's hit finish. OK, so now we're ready to test it. So I'm going to fire up a brand new tab inside of Internet Explorer, and I'm going to say public.geektrainer.com and hit enter. In a moment, we're going to see our little normal login screen, which is going to ask us which authentication provider we want to use. And I'm going to hit my drop down, and I'm going to choose Azure. what you're going to notice is that this is automatically going to log me on. The reason for that is, if you remember in an earlier step, I logged on to Windows Azure with my Microsoft account. So the browser already has the token from Microsoft Live ID. And so when we went to go connect, Windows Azure already saw that. It signed it, sent it back to SharePoint, and here we go. What you're going to notice in the upper right-hand corner is, well, an ugly bit of text that, unfortunately, one of the downsides to the Live ID implementation is it gives us back basically the token identifier. It doesn't give us back the actual email address. So that little string that you're seeing right there in the upper right-hand corner, that is what's actually being provided by Windows Azure and the Live ID. So what we saw in all of this is how to set everything up inside of Azure, how to set everything up inside of SharePoint, and then finally, the fact that it automatically authenticated me using the Microsoft ID because I had already signed on. The last little thing that we want to address, if we're going to be using federated authentication, is how to pass tokens from SharePoint to another internal application, or basically how to implement server-to-server authentication. Server-to-server authentication gives us the ability to take that federated token and use that to make requests on behalf of the user against other systems. Now you're going to notice that SharePoint, Exchange, and Link all support this capability. Now the catch, of course, in order for this to work, is that we are going to need to set up a trust relationship between these environments. As always, this is done with certificates. So what you're going to do is you're just simply going to set up the certificate and then call new SP trusted security token issuer on each system that's going to be making requests. There is federated authentication in SharePoint. I'm going to see you in the next lesson.